Welcome to another session of Math Snacks with Miss Glovely and Miss Wonderful. Miss Glovely, last time we were talking about, I've heard teachers tell over and over and over, they'd say, don't ask why, just invert and multiply when I was dividing fractions.
And that's really confusing.
It was. I was like, why does that work? But I think I've got it kind of figured out.
Okay, let's try that with a problem like we used last time. Let's start with a simple one this time so that you can show us why you think this works. So if we go back to our problem, which was 4 divided by 1/2, what would that look like with a manipulative?
Well, I took out 4 pieces, and because we were talking Hershey bars, and I don't mind sharing half my Hershey bar with somebody, but not 3/8. So I've got my 4 Hershey bars there, and I started to think about. We talked about how many halves are in 4. So if I divide each of mine in half, I ended up with 8 pieces. So, but what I would do procedurally, I guess, is I would take the 4. And I have to take each one of those times the number of pieces that are in each one. And because we divided them in half, there's 2 pieces in each whole.
Okay.
So if I take 4 times 2, I get the answer 8. And that's like inverting and multiplying that, because that's kind of like 2 over 1.
That makes sense.
So that also equaled, if I looked at it, 4 divided by half was 8. So this is why I think we invert the second number, the fraction, and we multiply it.
Okay, let's see if that works with our other problem that was more difficult for us last time. That problem was 3 1/2 divided by 3/8. So let me see if I get you right. Because we're going to take 3 1/2 things.
Here's 3 1/2.
Okay, and we have an 8 for our denominator here, so each of these would have to be broken up into 8 pieces. 8 full pieces.
Yeah, that's why I chose the 8, because I
Okay.
knew we needed to take 3/8 out of them.
Okay, so now,
So we were taking out 3/8 out of each of them, right?
correct,
But see, we're missing one here,
right,
because there's only 2 here.
right,
So I was thinking, I could go ahead and keep doing that, and we'd get the same thing we got last time, which was 9 1/3.
right.
But if I did that same invert and multiply, and keep the 3 1/2 the same, but I need to know how many times 3/8 goes into each of those.
Right.
So I invert it to 8/3.
Mm-hmm.
And I was trying to figure out, do I really have 8/3 here? And that was confusing for me.
Okay,
So I started thinking about it as a mixed number.
okay,
So if I change 8/3 into a mixed number, it comes out to 2 wholes
right,
and 2/3.
that's right.
And here's my 1 whole, here's my next whole, and I have 2/3
Of a whole.
of a whole.
That makes sense.
So for every one of these, if this had been just 3 divided by 3/8, it would have been, I would have had to take each one of these times 3/8,
That's,
or times 8/3, because there's 2 and 2/3 in each one of them.
that makes sense.
So I think that's why you invert and multiply.
Because there ends up being 2 new pieces that are the correct size.
Mm-hmm.
And 2/3 of another one that are the
Right.
correct size.
So there's 2 and 2/3, 3/8 in each whole.
Wow, that's still kind of confusing.
That is. It took me a little bit of time, because it's like I kind of got it and then I lost it. But every time I just go back to my simpler problem.
Mm-hmm.
So let's try another simpler problem that
Okay.
maybe is a little bit more difficult
Okay.
than a whole.
Okay, let me see if I can do it this time. You
Okay.
make up the problem,
Okay.
and I'll try to do it.
Let's do 6 1/2 divided by 1/2.
Okay, because I'm doing 6 1/2 divided by 1/2, each of my whole 6 should be 2 pieces.
Right, because
Okay.
you're wanting to get halves out of them.
Okay, so
anyhow.
there's 1, 2,
And I'm going to do what the teacher always tells me to do, is invert
3,
and multiply, and see if that makes
4.
sense.
Is it okay if I use the same color again?
Sure.
For my 6. There's 6.
I love your gloves today, by the way.
Well,
They're
thank
pretty
you.
green.
They're pretty green, aren't they? My grandmother had a whole collection of gloves, and that's why I like to wear them for math snacks.
Awesome.
It's
I'm
kind of
always-
my way of remembering my grandmother.
Well, that's neat.
Okay, so we have 6.5,
Mm-hmm.
and we're going to divide them in half. So I'm going to break each of them apart so they have 2 pieces each. Oh, well, could you help me with this, Miss Wonderful?
Mhm.
Sometimes it is kind of tricky with gloves on because things slip. And we end up with 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13.
So if I do the procedural part of that, because we can't really multiply it as a mixed number.
Right.
So we'd make that 13 halves.
Right.
By taking the 6 times 2 and add the 1.
Uh-huh.
13 halves. And then I take that times 2.
Right.
I get 26
That's correct.
on my numerator
Right.
and 2 on my denominator,
Right.
which reduces down to 13 wholes.
Yay, we
Yay!
did it right. Woo!
I think this works.
I think so too. It still might be a little confusing, but it's making more sense to me now.
I think we'll just have to keep practicing and trying different numbers and see if it continues to work.
Sounds like a plan to me.
It sounds like a plan to me, too. Join us for another session of Math Snacks.